Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event. This is the second in the current series of research seminars hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the BCLT's academic director and coordinator of the research seminar. As with previous events, this seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon on BCLT's YouTube channel, where you'll find recordings of previous seminars and other BCLT events. Now, for the last 25 years, BCLT has welcomed Indian translators and scholars to Norwich under the Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellowship Scheme. This year, unfortunately, for COVID reasons, we've had to move this residency online and make it a virtual residency, but we're delighted that we can nonetheless go ahead with the residency under these conditions. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our current Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow as this afternoon's speaker. Anindya Sekhar Purakayastha is Professor of English and coordinator of the Centre for Critical Social Inquiry at Kazi Nazrul University in West Bengal, India. Among his recent books are Literature, Cultural Politics and Counter-Readings, Hamlet as the Prince of Deconstruction, that's out from Routledge and Akar Books this year, 2021, and Violence in South Asia, Contemporary Perspectives, a co-edited volume from Routledge in 2019. His co-authored monograph on new social movements, media and civil society in contemporary India, and his co-edited volume on Deleuze, Guattari and Terror are forthcoming in 2022 from Palgrave Macmillan and Edinburgh University Press, respectively. Anindya co-edits Kairos, a journal of critical symposium, and is one of the founding members of the Post-Colonial Studies Association of the Global South. In 2017, he was selected as fellow in the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry at the New School for Social Research in New York. 2018-19, he was Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellence Fellow at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And in 2019, he was also a visiting guest researcher at Linnaeus University in Sweden for his research on the post-colonial public sphere. This semester, as I've mentioned, Anindya is the 2021 Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow at UEA, and he's working on a project versifying cosmopolitan hope amidst the wounds of time, translation of the Kallol era poets. And that's directly related then to his topic this afternoon. Before I hand over to Anindya, though, let me just say that after his talk, we'll have plenty of time for a question session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you would particularly like to see answered. That function then will be available all the way through Anindya's talk, so do please feel free to submit your questions and I'll put them to him on your behalf at the end. And the chat remains available all throughout as well. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Anindya for a talk which is titled Translation as Reparation and Justice, Autobiography of Kallol Era Poetry. Welcome, Anindya.
Thank you, Duncan. May I just share the slides and then I would begin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you, Duncan, for the kind introduction. Duncan has already talked in detail about the project and also about the specific title for today's talk. So I would prefer to go straight away to the subject of today's talk. Um, the Kallol poets, as you can see in the slides, were avant-garde group of poets who were initially associated with the Four Arts Club, established in the early 1920s in Calcutta, to discuss about new methods of writing and doing literature, as well as practicing other branches of art and aesthetics. These young group led by two gentlemen who played the vanguardist role, namely Gokul Chandra Nag and Dinesh Ranjan Das, subsequently decided to form the Kallol magazine, which will depart from mainstream Tagorean verse, or what was called in Bengal at that time as Robindra Anushari Kabya. Now, these poets were conscious about modern European literary trends unfolding at that time, and they responded to that moment of interwar period ravaged by death, destruction, and political unrest. If the European avant-garde experimented with style and theme, the Kallol poets did the same. And although the magazine lasted for just 6.5 years, within that short span of time, they could radically transform Bengali poetry and brought in strong elements of radicality in literary attitude and thematic treatment. Leading Kallol poets like Jibanananda Das, Kazi Nazrul Islam, Buddhadev Bose, Achinta Kumar Sengupta, Premendra Mitra, Humayun Kabir, Vishnu De, Jyotindranath Sengupta, to name a few, can be judged by the highest global literary standards by all means. And yet, the tragedy is that they are not that well known across the literary board and among the global literary fraternity. And this translation project attempts to bring them onto the world stage to a certain extent. You can well imagine the importance of the Kallol era poets from this particular fact, which I mention now. Historian Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, in his book The Defining Moments in Bengal, 1920 to 1947, published in the year 2014, while capturing the different momentous events in early 20th century Bengal, um, moments that determine different aspects of anti-colonial nationalism and cultural mobilizations, mention the Kallol era poets and their remarkable contributions in forming some defining moments in Bengali and Indian cultural history. Professor Bhattacharya said, and I quote, "Again in the 1920s, a new wave in literature, usually identified with the Kallol group of authors, opened up new horizons thematically and ideationally, whether or not these new writers, mostly from villages and small district towns, were able to overcome the overwhelming presence of Tagore. They certainly brought innovations into creative writing. For one thing, the proletariat and the subproletariat and various kinds of marginal men and women appear as protagonists in fictions and poetry for the first time. The new literary radicalism also meant the exploration of themes from which the Bhadralok literature, that is elite class of literature, averted its eyes till the Kallol era. So you can well understand the importance of the Kallol era that I narrated. And this is the first page of the book Kolloler Kal, or the Kallol era, written by a scholar called Jivendra Sinha Roy. It was published in the year 1960. And this is a classic book that talks in detail about the Kallol group of poets. Now, having talked about the backdrop, let me go to the translational aspect of it. In her translation of Mahashweta Devi's stories, Imaginary Maps, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak mentioned about her two-faced imaginings as her translation of Mahashweta's work faced two directions, encountered two readerships, both in India as well as in the United States or in the West. Now, this may remind someone of W.B. Du Bois's uh, famous statement about the double consciousness in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. But Spivak did speak about another imaginary in her title, Imaginary Maps, which is the imaginary of India as exercised by the West. His argument was the Anglophonic imaginary of India or of any former colony for that matter needs to be deconstructed, as he was convinced that through her translation of Mahashweta's text, she was attempting to do that. So her translation of Mahashweta Devi's Bengali text had some deconstructive pedagogic use according to Spivak's translational agenda. This perhaps applies to the project that I am undertaking here as part of my fellowship work, namely the translation of the Kallol era poets, about whom I have already spoken. Spivak, in her translator's preface, I beg your pardon, to imaginary maps, refer to the national cultural artifacts which are accessible to Indians, such as its art and literary text, which are generally encouraged to be museumized, and the profound Eurocentric uh, academic migrancy that we encounter on a regular basis fail to do justice to its richness and its actual discovery. Such ignorance or mistreatment of the vernacular or the local artifact necessitates newer mappings or new literary theoretical engagement. Spivak could describe this new cartographic hermeneutics as an ethical singularity or, quote unquote, secret encounter. It is not, however, a meeting in secret. No, what she means is in this secret singularity, the object of ethical action is not an object of benevolence. For her, the responses flow from both sides, that is, both from the East as well as from the West. Spivak was perhaps hinting at some form of ethics of cultural, if I can say, osmosis. And for her, she argued, ethics is the experience of the impossible, something that sharpens the need for collective struggle. While writing this translator's preface, Spivak interestingly even mentioned the Bandung Conference, which was held in the year 1955, which challenged the post-war global order and called for a new South-South dialogue, a new imaginary of mapping, something Du Bois or Frantz Fanon and many other anti-colonial thinkers have also talked about. Now, if we look from that angle, then we can say that after all, translation is nothing but this new coalitional bricolage among two or more than two different cultures and languages, isn't it? Now, when Bengali poet Shankha Ghosh and Alok Ranjan Dasgupta, in their seminal translation work named Sapta Sindhu Das Diganta, Seven Oceans and 10 Horizons, use the term, and I quote, Moitreo Momota, which can be translated as fraternity, to denote the ideology and objective of translation, or when Shankha Ghosh, again, in his new book of translation of world poetry, called his book Bohulo Devota Bohushar, multiple gods, multiple voices. This is the translation of the title adapted from T.S. Eliot's four-quartet section of Dry Salvages. Now, all these titles are hinting at this collegiality that I'm trying to talk about, this sense of hospitality, to borrow from Derrida, or the politics of friendship through translation. Translation, therefore, is that ethics of fraternizing the other. It remaps the unnavigated. Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel-winning Indian Bengali poet, who himself was a translator, once appreciated the translation of one of his contemporary Bengali poet for his what he called, and I quote, Dussahoshi Navik Britti, which can be translated as courageous navigational enterprise. Spivak described her translation or her translator self as a cultural worker, and this is significant, and even went to the extent of saying that the translator can approximate the task of the organic intellectual as he allows the subaltern to speak through the translated text. She says in her introduction to Mahashweta Devi's text, and I quote, when the subaltern speaks, in order to be heard and gets into the structure of responsible, that is responding and being responded to, resistance, he or she is on the way to becoming an organic intellectual. This is a big claim that the translator is facilitating the translated text or the actors involved in that translated text as the organic intellectual. The subaltern can speak through the translation. Spivak ends her translator's preface by quoting from South African writer Jan Coetze's comments on his translation of the Dutch poet Achterberg, and I quote, it is in the nature of the literary work to present its translator with problems for which the perfect solution is impossible. At such moments, the translator chooses in accordance with his conception of the whole. There is no way of simply translating the words. These choices are based literally on preconceptions, prejudgment, prejudice, etc. Now, having quoted Coetzee at length, Spivak concludes her own introduction by saying, upon acknowledgement of prejudice, not derived from the possibility of an unprejudiced translation, even in reading, bequeathed by a writer who responds to the compromised position of quote unquote white writing in South Africa, a much greater compromise than translating Mahashweta Devi into American English. And then Spivak concludes by saying, I invite you, the reader, to acknowledge your own prejudiced or position of reading and turn now to the text. I think this long excursus, if we can go to the other slides and can look into the Kallol letterhead. This is the letterhead of the Kallol group. They used to write to different writers through these letterhead. And these are iconic and historic, archival documents where you have this manifesto poem by the Kallol poets. And they talked about breaking away from the juggernaut of the mainstream writing, the conventional modes of articulation and literary expression as popularized by Tagore and his followers. And we also see that even Tagore heralded the arrival of the new and the radical in the Kallol group. And in this statement, Tagore welcomed them and welcome their new way of writing. And one of the very important manifesto poems, contained in the anthology of the Kallol era of poetry, written by Dinesh Ranjan Das, talked about the sheer outcry, the unslumbered directionlessness, and then tears wafting from the joy of the unknown known. My blued eyes, buoyant with that tide, pound the juggernaut day in and out. Can't recall in which past, on whose volition, my oceanic blue was marred by the incorrigible closes, fueling forever upheavals of dissent. Know that this outburst will never die. The mighty foams will never get dry, neither will human pain ever cease to be. And yet, my hapless soul keeps on crying, rendered speechless, retaining hope, except once, even after hundreds of years, the mute rock will crumble, breaking its static contentment. Tidal waves in its liquid uproar will animate all directions. So this breaking of the rock, the juggernaut, the status quo, and the monolith of the mainstream, and heralding the arrival of the new. This is the manifesto of the Kallol group of poets. And with this poem, they begin, the anthology or the journey of the Kallol era. That here is a moment for the arrival and for the beginning of the new, to strike a new chord and to navigate for the unknown. And I'll come to the next slide later, but this is what I wanted to bring to your notice about this directionality of the Kallol era poets who were responding to the avant-garde compatriots in Europe like Eliot, and also papal poets like Baudelaire and others in France and in other parts of Europe. Now, I think this long excursus on Spivak and her view about translation allowing the subaltern to speak, allowing the emergence of the organic intellectual from the global south or from the marginalized positions, all these long excursus was necessary on translation as remapping or as ethical singularity, as Spivak said. Um, the Moitri Momota, or fraternizing the other, as Shankho Ghosh and Alok Ranjan Dasgupta described, that fraternity or that fraternizing attempt through translation is important because this is the world which is hegemonized by, to quote Coetzee, as Spivak quoted him, the globish language of the global English language of this world. So therefore, some form of prejudiced fascination or fight for non-Eurocentric cultural text provides a prolegmen to what I mean by translation as justice and translation as reparation. It primarily amounts to a resistance to existing world literary systems in which there is no attempt for epistemic osmosis. Now, I borrow the word osmosis, the concept of the osmosis, from the Indian democrat and human rights activist B.R. Ambedkar, who used this idea of osmosis in his iconic book and seminal text, Annihilation of Caste. Now, translation as justice, as I try to argue, borrowing thinkers like Emily Apter, uh, is trying to posit the translator, if I can say, as the god of small writings, and which demands the attention of the big writers and demolish the model of literary stratification or the model of the literario hierarchicus. If I can borrow Louis Dumou's expression of homo hierarchicus in his reference to the Indian caste system. Now, my method of translation, therefore, as osmosis, definitely relates to what both Emily Apter and Gayatri Spivak mean by the politics of translation, calling for a two-way traffic between the translator and the translated. In other words, the autobiography of Eliot's The Wasteland as a path-breaking modern text relied on its unprecedented global acknowledgement as a seminal text. We will see in the course of today's talk how some of the Kallol era poets translated Eliot extensively and how Eliot influenced them in their in their outlook, in their literary outlook, in their act of writing, in their poetic positions, etc. So the fact remains that all these great European writers were highly acknowledged by all these poets in India. And therefore, the argument can run in this way, that by the same logic, it is the autobiography, OTO, as described by or as argued by Derrida, that makes the autobiography knowable to all. Otology, as Derrida said, is the science of hearing or reaching up to the ear of the other. So unless and until a particular text reaches up to the ear of the other, it cannot be known, and therefore it remains confined within its own marginal location. Translation, therefore, acts as the surrogate or the nurse in this transition of the auto to the ear of the other, or to the attention of the other. While Bengali poets of early 20th century were immersed in British poetry, and quite naturally so, because they were living under colonial rule, they were ideologically drawn towards translating the European poets. And if one looks closely, one can easily understand how translation of European poetry played a big role in the formation of what we call modern Bengali poetry. I will go into that history, but before I go into the details of that fascinating chapter of translation done by early modern Bengali poets, including Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore translated Eliot's The Journey of the Magi as Tirthojatri, the pilgrimer. So very interesting. These are fascinating anecdotes and fascinating part of translational history, the dialogue between the East and the West, as far as this conversation between these two group of poets is concerned. Now, let me claim and argue that modern Bengali poet translators evinced remarkable cosmopolitanism and a spirit of openness, a politics of hospitality, which is missing when it comes to global responses to modern Indian or Bengali writing. And that necessitated this project of translating the Kallol poets, or for that matter, the poets of the 40s, 50s, and the 60s, attempting their autobiography, OTO, that is bringing them onto the world stage, even if I'm not sure whether I'll be able to approximate the global standard of writing. But my effort here is to quote Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a globalectical translation. Ngugi wa Thiong'o spoke of orature as opposed to the standard idea of literature. So what is the harm in attempting the orature version of translation through which the subaltern might speak? To do that, let me now come to the second part of my presentation, which is the Kallol poets and the tradition of translation among them, a legacy which was continued by all the next generation modern Bengali poets. Now, this is, as I said moments back, a very important part of this history. For me, the most important research question is that why all these poets in Bengal right from 1905, they decided to translate the European text in such large numbers. Another important point is that they not only translated the European poets, they also translated poets from other states of India, from tribal poets. So this is really remarkable. As I said, that they evinced a strong sense of cosmopolitanism and hospitality to poetic voices from other traditions. And this is what I mean by translation as justice and translation as osmosis, the give and take among different traditions. And many of the prominent Kallol poets were outstanding scholar academics. They were teaching in colleges and universities, and they were remarkable translators. I would, however, restrict my discussion among 3 or 4 distinguished members among them and their contemporaries, and they are namely Satyendranath Datta, Sudhindranath Datta, Buddhadev Bose, and Vishnu De. All three were well-known, or some of them were well-known Kallol poets, and some of them were their close contemporaries who heralded the new in modern Bengali poetry, and they could do that because they were all translating and conversing with the global tradition. Now, this slide, as you can see, mentions a particular text called Tirtha Sholil. This is a book of translation done by Satyendranath Datta, and I'll go into the detail, but before I talk about it, let us look into the preface of this book, Tirtha Sholil. It talks about the collection of the best specimens of the world poetry in translated form, an assemblage of literary pilgrimages. Tirtha in Bengali means the pilgrimage. So it's a kind of a pilgrimage to the world stage of literary activities. And the manifesto poem of this particular book, Tirtha, another book of translated text, anthology done by the same man, Satyendranath Datta. He translated 3 books of translated poems. One was Tirtha Sholil, the other one is Tirtha Renu, and the third one was Moni Manjusha. And taken together, he translated more than 500 poems in these 3 anthologies. This is remarkable. And if we look into this manifesto poem, we see that it can be translated or summarized in this way, that he is claiming that he tried to bring the poetic conference of the world on your doorstep, redeeming my holy grail with the multiplicity of my pilgrimage. And you come, he's inviting this reader to come hear how the poets of the world resonate through your courtyard. So this is how they are launching this dialogue with the larger world. And this is how translation is bridging this gap between India and the outside world, or even Bengal and other states of India, the center and the margin, and various forms of divisions. If we continue in that, we see that the same book and the poems contained in that book talk about all writers hailing from different horizons and continents, writing in different languages, mingle here in this coalitional effort. So this is what I meant when I said in the very beginning in today's talk, when I said translation as coalition. So these are the great Bengali translator poets who were poets first and translators at the same time, who converts with the outside world, learned from them, and proved. And I continued from that same book, where he used the word Prem Jomunay Mileche Ajike Sneho Gangar Dhara. And I have translated it in this way, the 1,000 plateaus of translated work. So translation as fraternity or as hospitality to the other. So if we look into this, and all these 3 books were published in the year 1906, 1910, 1912, something around the first decade of 20th century. And this for me is remarkable. And you can see that how these are the people who are preparing the ground for the Kallol era poets to look to the West, to continue the dialogue of exchange of ideas and views. If you look into this title page, you can see that this page of Tirtha Renu, Tirtha Renu can be translated as particles of world literary gems converging through translation, conjoining all continents. Here we see that the term Tirtha Renu has been written in the form of a Farsi alphabet. And this has been done by none other than Abanindranath Tagore, who was a very well-known artist at that time. So you can see the conference of writers, the assemblage of writers, artists, and all those avant-garde actors who were assembling together, trying to do something remarkable. And if you look into the title, we see that The manifesto poem is described as Tirther, Tirther Dhuli Muthi Muthi. These are the particles of different gems of world literary writings being assembled for the readers by this translator. And he translates from different corners of the globe as well as different corners of India as well. He translates from Telugu, he translates from Nepali, he translates from Latin America and other places as well. So this is the first edition of the Tirtho where Satyendranath Datta writes about the objective of this particular book. And if we go further, we see that this is the manifesto poem that I refer to, is the full form, Tirther Dhuli Muthi Muthi Tuli Koriyachi Ek Thai, which can be briefly summarized as grains of literary pilgrimages clustered to this transcription, basking in the glow of the world muse, caressing each and every chord of the global imaginary lyre. Poets of the past, hailing from different lands, are revived through these words. The eternal glow of the deceased bards radiates through these pages. So this is the glorious history of translation, which was done by these early generation Bengali poets who were poets at the same time, translators, were constantly, aware, keeping them aware about what is unfolding the global scale, and try to replicate and reproduce that in their own way, in their own writings. And all of them agreed and acknowledged the importance of translation. And they said that without this act of translation, we would not have been what we are as a poet. So translator is emerging as the deliverer of the world heritage. And if you go further, you see that the same tradition of translation among the Kallol era poets and later poets who were influenced by the Kallol era poets like Shankha Ghosh and Alok Ranjan Das Gupta. They continued this rich legacy of translation. We can see that Sudhindranath Datta wrote a translated book called Shogoto, and this is the one that I mentioned some minutes back, Shapto Sindhu Das Diganto. This is another book of translated poetry in Bengali by Shankha Ghosh and Alok Ranjan Das Gupta, where in the long introduction, they use the term translation as Moitri Momota, that act of fraternity, that act of hospitality to the other. So these are very important archival documents that helps us to understand, the activities which are going on at that time in the world of Bengali poetry, Bengali translation, and how all the leading poets of the Kallol era were poets as well as important translators. They learned from the West, internalized that, applied that in their own writing, and enriched their own writing and emerged as important poets. Now, having talked about this, let me get back to what I was talking of. Looking at early 20th century Bengali poetic trends, one encounters prodigious amount of translation, as I mentioned, and the first collection of world poetry in Bangla were translated anthologies like Tirtho Sholil, Tirtho Renu, and Moni Manjusha, which I mentioned. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, looking at these translations, appreciated them in a big way and said that the translations were not just Shilpokarjo, which can be translated as artifacts, but also Srishtikarjo, that is creative acts. Earlier, after reading Tirtho Sholil, Tagore had written that the translated poems had taken shelter in the branches of the original to blossom in all their beauty and rasa. The translation of a poem was, in fact, he writes, both a translation and a new poem. The translation of a poem, in other words, had to be accepted as a poem in the target literature too. As a poet, Satyendranath Dutta occupies an important place for his experiments with sound patterns, and often as translator, he finds an incentive in source language poems to explore such patterns. The Japanese tanka, the Malaysian phantom, the verse patterns of Paul Verlaine and Victor Hugo, and certain metrical patterns of Sanskrit poetry were all introduced by Satyendranath Dutta in Bangla through his translation. So this was a clear case of how translation of world poetry and of other traditions helped him to grow his own poetic activity. Subsequently, other prominent modern Bangla poets like Sudhindranath Datta, Buddhadev Bose, and Vishnu De, among these, Buddhadev Bose and Vishnu De were important members of the Kallol era poets. They came out with remarkable pieces of translated anthologies. Sudhindranath called his anthology Pratidhwani, which can be translated as reverberations. Now, if we go to the pages, this is the translation of Baudelaire by Sudhindranath, and also the first page of his translated book, Pratidhwani, essays on different aspects of translation, other aspects of creative writing, called Pratidhwani, which is translated as reverberations. So it's trying to suggest that translation is a kind of a reverberations of the original. And in this book, he talked about the French poets and other European poets whom he translated. Buddhadev translated Charles Baudelaire, and wrote extensively on the act of translation and its importance to develop Bengali poetry. Another leading Kallol era poet, Vishnu De, became famous for translating T.S. Eliot and called his translated anthology Alien Flowers. Qazi Nazrul Islam, another very important member of the Kallol group of poets, translated Hafiz and Rumi, and also translated from Omar Khayyam. And his poetic texts reflect clear influences of the Persian tradition of poetry and Persian philosophy. The rich legacy of Bengali translation of world poetry inspired later poets the 1940s and 50s. Subhash Mukhopadhyay, another very important name in Bengali poetry, modern Bengali poetry, translated Najim Hikmat and Pablo Neruda. And Shankha Ghosh and Alok Ranjan Dasgupta, whom I have mentioned again and again, two celebrated poetic voices in Bengal, translated poets from different corners of the globe and called that anthology Shapto Sindhu, Das Diganta, and Bohulo Devota, Bohushor, which can be translated as many gods, many voices, as I said, which is adopted from T.S. Eliot's Trisalutages in his four quartets. Shumil Gangopadhyay, another very important Bengali poet, also came out with an anthology called Unno Desher Kobita. If we go to the slides, you can see this is the front page of poems of other countries. This is Unno Desher Kobita. You can see that it contains poetry from France, from Italy, from Latin America, from Caribbean islands, from Britain, other parts of the world, from across the board, African American writers. So you can see the cosmopolitanism that I was talking about. Now, if we go further and press this argument further, we'll see that the very names of these translated anthologies are significant. Tirtho Sholil and Tirtho Renu, or Munimanjusha, connote a sense of pilgrimage in the very confluence of world poetry. The Bengali word Tirtho, as I said, means pilgrimage, and Salil or Renu stand for oceanic confluence or the particles of the sea of world poetry. While Munimanjusha, the Bengali word, suggests a collective that contains the best specimens of world poetry, which we as literary pilgrims must savor. This was a fascinating trend of borderless poetry, or poetry of the world, unaffected by world systems of cultural brands and values, or a system which is unsullied by the political economy or the existing ecosystem of cultural hierarchy. Shankha Ghosh, in his anthology, Many Gods and Many Voices, or Seven Seas and Ten Horizons, these are translated anthologies of global poetry, also hinted at the globality of the poetic output, which were given equal weightage and respect. Shankha Ghosh even named one section of his best translated poems as, I quote, Shekhorer Dana. For me, it is very interesting and very important. Shekhorer Dana can be translated into English as wings of the root. Shekhar is root, R-O-O-T, suggesting that the root text allows itself to take wings. And that is how translation happens. One can argue that this is a perfect example of translation as nomadology, navigating the thousand plateaus, the root text allowing the desiring machine of translation to take wings and discover the polysemic pluriverse through the translation, which is nothing but a nomad text. This is the new imaginary mapping that we referred to in the very beginning when we were talking about Gayatri Spivak's translation of Mahashweta Devi, a fraternizing mode of deterritorialization that reterritorializes, to follow Zillah's deluge, existing cultural or global orders. Translation of early modern Bengali poets were acts of global literary pilgrimage. But the question remains whether these poets, in spite of being outstanding poets themselves, have largely remained unknown in the context of world poetry, and any attempt to translate them and the story will be an act of translation as reparation and translation as justice. I will end by referring to what Sudhindranath Dutta, whom I mentioned again and again, said in the preface to his translated anthology called Pratidhani, when he described translation with the figure, the Indian epical figure of Ekolabha. And I will conclude by explaining what did he mean by it. In the great Indian epic, Mahabharata, the legendary hero with so-called tribal or quote-unquote lower caste origin, Ekolabha, after being refused by the royal uh, trainer, Dronacharya, was the master archer, the military trainer, made himself well equipped in the art of archery through dedicated practice in front of a clay model of Dronacharya, the master figure. However, he had to pay Guru Dakshina, or paying the preceptor, from whose absence he learned the technique of archery, the art of fighting, art of archery, as he belonged to the quote unquote untouchable caste. Through Dronacharya, who demanded the cutting of his right thumb that acts as a lever to shoot the arrow. In this way, Dronacharya succeeded to retain the royal dominance of his royal disciples and to erase subaltern mastery. Sudhindranath Datta, a great poet of early 20th century Bengal, a great translator, uh, decided to compare the act of translation with this figure of the outcast, quote unquote, the outcast, or Ekalabha, who always tries to, represent his or her text, but is not always allowed to do that in the existing system of representation. And this is where the politics of translation, the politics of translatability, the politics of representation comes to the forefront, and translation um, uh, emerges as an act of justice and reparation when the autobiography of the poet is demanded through the autobiography, through its representation to the other, or by embracing the other and by allowing the self to be accessible to the other. And that is how we can think of translation as an act of reparation or as an act of justice. Thank you. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Anindya. What a wonderfully rich presentation, and thank you so much for the breadth of that presentation and showing us just how broad the interests of your poets were in this period. Can I invite our audience to place your questions, please? Use in the chat or in the Q&A. I wonder if I can begin, though, Anindya, by asking you about. I mean, I was fascinated by the examples that you were giving, particularly towards the end, these translations of Eliot and Baudelaire and so on. And from my thinking back over the examples from translation history in the West, very often this kind of a very rich period of translation coincides with a period when a literary language is developing itself. And so I suppose I wonder whether this is the case here, whether what we're seeing with this very rich, very very wide-ranging and rich translation tradition is, could one say, the sort of the establishment of modern literary Bengali? Is that a concern of these poets as well?
Yes, absolutely right, Duncan. So this is exactly what they wanted to do. As I said, that it was a kind of a two-way process. That if we read these poets, you'll see that how Baudelaire or the French symbolist poets were so influential in their own writing. In fact, if we read the works of Vishnu De and figures like Buddhadev Bose or Sudhindranath Dutta, they are writing in a completely new form of the Bengali language, which is not available prior to them. So, as I said, that would not have been possible had they not, opened up to their European counterparts and learned from them. So that helped in a big way in the enrichment of the Bengali language, making it more cosmopolitan, more, if I can say, metropolitan in that way, global. And it also helped in the formation of symbols and the use of imageries, in the rhythm, in the use of the meter and the metrical aspect of poetry. So in all areas, both in the domain of the thematic as well as in the stylistic part of poetry writing, they were highly influenced by these translations. And yes, the Bengali language itself was changed through that process. Absolutely.
Thank you. And so it sounds as though they're importing literary forms as well and developing them in Bengali perhaps for the first time.
Yes, that happened. I mean, there are detailed analysis of it. If you read their processes, remarkable processes, and I hope that one day all these essays will also be translated. They will be counted as great theoreticians of translation studies. I especially think of Buddhadev Bose, who is already quite well known in the West. He taught in in the US, and Sudhindranath Dutta also went to the outside world. He toured Europe with Tagore. So they wrote extensively about different aspects of translation, and in those processes they have made detailed comparisons about a particular stanza that they have taken from Baudelaire, how that could be changed in this format, how the stanza form can can also percolate into the Bengali tradition of poetic stanza writing, the use of images, the use of expressionist techniques and the other avant-garde techniques of writing. So it helped in a big way in the emergence of Bengali poetry in the context of translation of world poetry and how modern Bengali poetry moved away from the mainstream Tagorean tradition and went to a completely different direction. Yes.
Talking of Tagore, though, I was really interested to hear of how generous Tagore himself was in response to these sort of these young poets who, in one sense, were looking to reject the legacy of Tagore. I was thinking of again a European example, thinking of Goethe, who was much less generous in his response to the German romantic poets, who were the younger generation who were coming through in his time, and he kind of freely admitted that he didn't really get at least some of the poetry that they were producing, and yet it seems that Tagore was much more helpful to these poets. And am I right in thinking that Tagore himself published in the Kallol journal?
Yes, exactly. That is what you may recall, I told you about that in the introductory chat that we had. The Tagore, the fascinating thing about the Kallol era poetry is that they wanted to deviate from mainstream Tagorean writing, and yet Tagore was also a part of the Kallol era poets. In fact, if you look closely into the anthology, you will see that there are mentions of Tagore's sending a particular poem to the Kallol office from a ship on his way to Europe. So he was that serious about, sending. I could see that it mentioned that this was dispatched from this particular ship when he was on his way to Europe. So that proves his sincerity and his commitment to the new wave of writing. That is one. Another important fact is that Tagore, as you know, that Tagore himself was a translator. In fact, he translated his own poems from Gitanjali, which was, of course, that's a different chapter, which was critiqued by many scholars, but that's a different territory altogether. I'm not going into that. But Tagore translated many German poets, French poets, and another important chapter of this translation history is Vishnu, whom I mentioned, who was part of the Kallol group, who was also a big scholar himself of English literature. He translated Eliot and sent that to Tagore for his assessment. Tagore corrected it, and it was published as Tirthojatri, that was the journey of the Magi from Eliot. So Tagore was also helping in this act of translation. So I'd say that it is very generous, not only generous, I would say it's very spirited of him that he was being attacked by them, and yet he was open to these new and young voices of poetry.
Thank you. We've a number of questions have been coming in, so I think we can turn to questions which have been coming in fact, in the chat, and perhaps you can, Anindya, you can also see them then. A first question. Thank you, Mahendra, for putting your question in the chat, and the Q&A will come on to your question shortly. Can we perhaps take the first question here from Tritaman Chakraborty? Great presentation, so thank you. To put my points briefly, what do you think of various critical works that contest translation on the ground that core ideas are lost in translated words, thus Klasa as class, Swaraj as self-rule, Vishwa Sahita as world literature cannot articulate some central ideas that underlie these concepts?
Okay.
So I suppose it's a question about untranslatability then, whether these are adequately translatable at least.
Okay. Should I go for this question, Duncan, or should I take?
Please do.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So to go for this, to answer this question by Thritiman, this is an old debate in translation studies about the question of verisimilitude or losing the kernel, so to say. But I think this is what I said today all through, that translation is a problematic zone. The translation zone, as Emily Apter says, is the problematic, at the same time is inevitable, is necessary. So translation is necessary, although we know that there are challenges involved. There are certain words, as Emily Apter, and we'll talk about it in the context of the next events, where we will discuss about the question of untranslatability that Emily Apter has theorized. Many others, including Duncan himself, has written and edited a book on untranslatability, published by Routledge. And these are issues that all translators, these are the challenges that all translators would face. But then that is the challenge that we have in translation. We have to negotiate with these challenges and have to come to a solution. And as I said, that as James Kwesi says, Spivak quoted him, that there is no solution as such. Sometimes the translation will be prejudiced, sometimes it would be wrong, but then this is how we have to move. In between, we'll come with something, but it is always better to have a translation rather than not having anything. I mean, this is what Duncan, was talking about, how this vast history of translated anthologies changed modern Bengali poetry. Imagine the situation if all these anthologies were not there. Bengali poetry would have been in a different terrain. So this conversation, this dialogue is necessary, and translation allows the dialogue to happen. If I can go.
Thank you, Anindya. That's a lovely answer. And I realize I meant to say just after your previous answer, you made reference to an earlier conversation that we had, and perhaps I can also direct our audience to the BCLT YouTube channel, where you will find an earlier conversation that Anindya and I had around Anindya's current project, and that's by way of an introduction to the project, and again to the Kallol era poets. And we did the question of the relation to Tagore came up there as well. And you've also just mentioned so beautiful advanced publicity for an event that we are currently planning for later on in Anindya's residency. This will be at the end of November, and it's not advertised yet. We're still planning it, but we will be advertising it very soon, and there will be a particular focus on precisely the question of untranslatability and Bangla poetry. So watch this space, as they say, and in general, do have a look at the BCLT homepage on bclt.org.uk, which has details of all our forthcoming events involving Anindya and our other events this term. Let's turn then to one of our next question from Risha Biswas. Thank you for your enlightening presentation. My question is, in the 19th century, when colonial Bengal is struggling with anti-colonial resistance through cultural nationalism and so on, did the poems of Kallol era poets reflect this dilemma, as they are cosmopolitan in their approach?
Well, that's a good question. But I think I remember I referred to Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, the historian, and his book, The Defining Moments in Bengal, from the 1920s to the 1940s, late 1940s. That was the defining moment when, on the one hand, you have this anti-colonial movement going on in the political front. And the cultural front, you have this attempt to find your own voice. And this is exactly what the Kallol era poets were trying to do. Now, when you reach out to your counterparts in Europe, they were not, they were not choosy of thinking only about, say, French poets or only about European poets or only about American poets. Premendra Mitra, for example, translated Whitman. Tagore also translated Whitman. So they were really cosmopolitan in their approach. They were looking at all directions. And I think I welcome this. I mean, when you go for asserting your autonomy in the domain of politics, you are asking for freedom, political freedom. Your aesthetic freedom is also necessary, but that aesthetic freedom is not to be, attained at the cost of your conversation with the other, because that will lead to a kind of closure and aporia, which is not expected and not to be welcome. They were really poet in the true sense of the term, and they wouldn't mind talking to their European brethren or to their British counterparts, as Tagore did. Duncan referred to W.B. Yeats, for example, who, as Duncan was trying to refer to, who called himself the last romantic. So Tagore was also hinting at the same thing. He said that I am the romantic and I don't go with these modernist tendencies. There are fascinating debates about it. But I think what makes this period so important for us is the cluster of new ideas in the world of culture, poetry, painting. They open the doors for new ideas to flourish. And this is how you attain true freedom, isn't it? Otherwise, it would be a kind of closed and parochial ethno-nationalist model that we'll be sticking to, which is not a welcome move. So I think they tried to do that. They challenged orthodoxies in the home front. They also challenged the colonial rule. They challenged all forms of status quo. And in that way, we should be welcoming them. So I think that in a certain way answer your question that whether they were uh, addressing the question of anti-colonial nationalism. Yes, they did, but their methodology was not a kind of revivalist traditionalism or tribalism going to the ethnic root. No, they welcomed newer ideas to come, and in that way they were truly cosmopolitan. That's it.
Great, thank you. I wonder if we could take Erin Riddle's question next. Erin says, thank you for your presentation. Can you talk more about the role, if any, of translation as reparation stroke justice in translating European texts, where European languages and cultures are a dominating culture in the colonial history? In other words, do you see translation during this era and with these translators as having a role in somehow intervening in the continuation of colonization through the dissemination of European literature?
Thank you. This is also an important question, but I think this question relates to the question that I just answered, which was offered by Richa, which is that I don't think we need to look through the perspective of this, the binary perspective of the East and the West, the European or the non-European. I understand that when we talk about decoloniality or the post-colonial, and I do subscribe to that domain, definitely. This project comes within the larger rubric of post-colonial studies and decoloniality studies. Translation as a decolonial exercise or as a decolonial tool is important for me. But as I said moments back, the world that we are thinking of, the poetic world, the world of a deconstructed vision, is not a world that believes in any idea of, to quote Derrida, the idea of the presence, whether we call it Indian or what we call European. These are all terms that can be problematized, that can be, challenged and deconstructed, because we are living in a global scenario. And if we are talking about globalization or globality of understanding in the domain of literature, if you can think of literature of the world or literatures of the world, the pilgrimage that I referred to, I don't think these border makings are something that we should be encouraging. I completely understand your point, and I agree with what you are trying to hint at. But I think post-colonial scholars also need to move beyond these closures of looking into the English language only as a kind of a colonial intervention, because the English language has to be changed, has to be internalized. I mean, when writers like Arundhati Roy or others are writing in the English language, they're changing it in their own way. Similarly, Indian poets who are writing in the English language, they're also changing it in a completely different way. So I think um, uh, to answer your question, I don't think that when we translate in the English language, we are reiterating or repeating that same colonial hangover. We have to keep in mind that we do not retreat to those clauses. And keeping that in mind, I think, in fact, in today's context in India, there are traces of colonial power within the country. As I refer to the caste system, there are issues of religious polarization and other issues. So you have different forms of power within the national boundary. So it's not just the colonial hangover is coming only from the outside. You have the tribals and the lower caste, quote unquote, lower caste people being dominated by the upper caste. The minorities are being coerced by the majoritarian religious groups. So all these power plays are going on. So I think when we talk about cosmopolitanism or translation, translation emerges as an act of reading, and that starts from the home itself, from my own surrounding itself. So I think while your question is understandable, I think I would take it in a much more broader sense, and I would say that I need to go beyond this binary models of East and the West and Europe and non-Europe. That's it.
Thank you. You mentioned Arundhati Roy, and I enjoyed your remark in the talk about translation as the translator as the god of small writings, which is a very nice. A very nice comment, and I would refer our audience again to our YouTube site, where you will find the public lecture which she gave, our annual Zebalt lecture a few years ago. We've had now then. Let's turn to Mahendra Yadav's question. It's a brief question. Since you, in the latter part of your response to the previous question, you raised the question of the relation to caste, and Mahendra asks, do you agree that Kallol era literature totally belongs to only elite or Bhadralok community? If yes, does it mean it had no connection with the mass?
Thank you, Mohendra, for the question. I think Debarati's question also relates to the same point. So if I can take the liberty of answering them together, Debarati
absolutely.
also,
Let's just perhaps read that question then. Thanks for the spirited presentation, says Debarati. Do you agree that Kallol era poets could translate the subaltern voices in their works? And if so, what dialogue could they bring into the domain of mainstream Bengali literature that could challenge the poetics of looking at life and times of their contemporary?
Right. So these two questions are related. So we can answer it in this way, that this can safely be said, and I can confirm it, that if you read the poems of the Kallol era poets, most of them were hailing from the subaltern background. Many of them were coming from the rural areas. I can, for example, uh, talk about Nazrul Islam himself, who was very poor, who worked as a soldier during the First World War in Karachi, Pakistan, in today's Pakistan. And I was talking to Duncan a few days back, and I referred to Nazrul, who can be also studied as a war poet, because when we talk about war poetry, we generally talk about Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, and others. But Nazrul was also someone who worked in the cantonment, and he imbibed the Persian tradition when he was in Karachi. So many of them were coming from poor families. Shailajananda Mukhopadhyay, for example, was a prominent member of the Kallol era writers who was known as the coal miners writer. So he wrote extensively about the people who were working in the coal mines at that time in India, in Bengal to be more precise. Nazrul was from Asansol, where my university is located, and Asansol is known as the mining belt of Bengal. It produces a lot of coal, and the people who are working in the mines are still not living in a healthy condition. There are mining mishaps, many of them die most of the times. So all these people have talked about this. Before Shailajananda, you cannot come across anyone writing about the coal miners in Bengali poetry or Bengali literature. Before Nazrul, you do not come across anyone talking about the poor. Premendra Mitra, for example, in one of his poems says that I am a poet of the poor, I am a poet of the workers, the masses. So all of them, Achinta Kumar Sengupta, for example, was another very important member of the Kallol group of poets who in fact wrote the book, The Kallol Era. And from that book, the term Kallol era became very famous. And this is an anecdotal study of the time. And Achinta Kumar was also a very well-known writer who is also credited for bringing rural Muslim life in Bengali literature. So you can well imagine that before them, in mainstream Bengali writing, you could not see the representation of Muslim life or lower class life or the subaltern sections, the miners. The Kallol group of poets were addressing the Bhadraloks, the elites. Many prominent writers were writing in the Kallol magazine, but majority of the writers in the Kallol group were from the subaltern section. So therefore, they could naturally speak about the subaltern class. So they were not out and out Bhadrlok or elite writers. On the contrary, they did represent the subaltern section.
Super, thank you. A question in the Q&A now from Mursad Alam. Actually, it follows on very nicely from your previous answer where you mentioned Nazrul. And Mursad asks, since you talked about the South-South dialogue, my question is, except Nazrul, were there any major attempts on the part of the Kallol poets to translate the works of poets from the Arabic Persian world, which still remains underdone in Bengal?
To answer the question, a big yes, because all these anthologies, Tirtho Renu, Tirtho Sholil, Monimunjusha, Putibimbo, if you read closely, I mean, for paucity of time and space, I couldn't, I'm sorry for that. I could have shown the details, but they contain poetry from Egypt, poetry from the Middle East, poetry from Umar Khayyam. So it's not just Najrul. I mean, it would be incorrect to say that only Najrul brought that element of Islamic tradition in Bengali writing. No, even before him, and that is the fascinating part of Bengali poetry in early 20th century. Even Tagore also translated Hafiz and Umar Khayyam. So they were conversant with these voices. But yes, it is correct that it is because of Nazrul's proximity to Persia, because of his, as I said, he being posted in Karachi cantonment, where he could talk with many people who were, because that was closer to Iran and Iraq, and he could know about what was happening in Russia during the October Revolution, what was unfolding in Iraq, in Iran. It was easier for Nazrul to know more about all this information directly because he was stationed and located in Karachi at that time. These poets couldn't travel to those areas, but they were really cosmopolitan in the true sense of the term because they not only translated European writers, as I kept on saying, they also looked to other states within India, Telugu poetry, Tamil poetry, Santali poetry, Japanese poetry, Middle Eastern poetry, Egyptian poetry, African poetry, Australian Aboriginal poetry. I was astounded to see that they have translated, children's rhymes and other texts from Australian Aboriginal writers way back in 1906. It's really cosmopolitan in every sense of the term. So I think we can safely conclude and say and affirm that most of them uh, were aware about the Middle East. But it is true, and as I said, and part of the reason is that most of these translator poets were professors of English. So they were dealing with French symbolists, with the European modernists. So therefore, it was natural for them to go for translating those writers. But it's not that they didn't know or they didn't pay any attention to these Arabic writers.
Thank you. A question from Tariq Monawar. Thanks a lot, sir, for the engaging presentation. Do you agree that translation of peripheral vernacular literature of the underrepresented global South be a potential response to, stroke critique, of the mainstream discourses of the global North colonizer states by offering insights into the complex peripheral eco-political scenario of the global South countries?
Well, this
that's quite a big question, I think.
Yeah, it's a quite heavy. I think Tariq, to be honest and to be fair, as I answered moments back about this binary model, which I don't go with this, this binary differentiation of the global north and the global south. These are the terms that we use for our convenience, scholarly convenience. But the reason I refer to Spivak's translation of Mahashada Devi has a reason. And the reason is that Spivak, while translating Mahashada Devi's text, is critiquing Indian class system, the Indian caste system the most. So when we critique the outside world, we need to understand that we are actually posing our critique and our criticism to the power structures which are available both inside as well as outside. So as I said that when we use the term colonial, we have to be very careful because there are enough structures of colonialism within India itself, within the global South. You can see that there are ethnic divisions, caste divisions, class divisions. People are fighting with each other. Yes, global capitalism, neoliberal economic policies, different global systems and orders, I refer to the existing ecosystem of branding certain text as big text and underplaying or downplaying texts, for example, the texts of the Kallol era poets or other poets, whom the outside world do not know. But then again, here the responsibility is ours. I mean, if these are the poets whom the outside world do not know, then I think the onus is on us to make them knowable. So we have to translate, and that's the only way out. We have to translate, and we have to talk. We have to engage with their works more and more. And this is perhaps how, for example, as I said, that they translated those European writers, and as Duncan rightly asked the question, that impacted Bengali language, the poetic style, the use of imagery. It completely transformed the world of Bengali poetry, right? So similar is the case with this one. The more we engage in our own work, if you look into the PhD dissertations being carried out in the subcontinent, most of them are working on European writers or American writers, and very few would be interested to know more about writers closer home. So I think the onus is on us, and I understand and admit that the geopolitical order, the system of stratification is there, but it's not just there in the outside world, it's there within the country. Nationalism itself is under suspect and under scanner because every day we are facing the different, consequences of overdoing the nationalist question. So I think all these are important points, and these poets raise these questions in a very important way. And the more we talk about them, the more we can, facilitate the autobiography, and that is how we can make them known to the outside world. I hope I could answer.
Thank you. Your answers have been terrific and so full and rich in themselves. Time is moving on, and I wonder if I could ask a question which relates specifically to your translation project. And I suppose I was thinking, thank you for sharing some of your translations with us in the course of your presentation. I mean, they're wonderful translations and wonderful poetry. And I suppose my question is, why is it necessary still to translate this wonderful poetry? And I was wondering, after Tagore won the Nobel Prize, then very often these days, when there's been a Nobel Prize winner from a country which is not perhaps so prominent in the literary culture of the West, then lots of translations follow, and it seems as though that just didn't happen, perhaps, for these poets. I mean, they themselves were, as you were arguing, post-Tagorean, but post the Tagore Nobel Prize, it's not as though there was, it seems, a big movement to translate these poets and other Bengali authors, and so now it's still necessary now to try. I mean, it's wonderful that you are taking this project on, but I'm puzzled in a way that it's now 100 years on.
Absolutely. This is, I completely agree with you. And the reason that this legacy got lost is, I think the Department of English is to be blamed, Duncan, for it, because, as I said, to my answer to Tariq's question, that why we are no longer engaging with this wonderful resources, these wonderful poetic minds. We are working more and more on um, uh, European writers, which is okay. I mean, I'm not averse to that. We should, but not at the cost of these wonderful writers. We need to look into the archives. These resources are quite rich. And I think it's better late than never. Young scholars are working on it. I think the comparative literature departments are few in number in India. And that is perhaps part of the reasons that uh, this native writers are not being foregrounded the way they should have been. But I think the trend is slowly changing because of the debates rotating around the question of nationalism. People are looking back to the 19th century because that was the time for the genesis. That was the genesis moment for Indian anti-colonial nationalism. Political scientists are looking to that cultural hotspot, the 19th century Bengal, from where this question of cultural assertion, cultural affirmation began. And all these poets, and remember, the reason I refer to Shubhashachi Bhattacharya's book, who is a historian, a very well-known historian, who brought the Kallol era poets when he's writing a book of history of Bengal and Indian nationalism. The reason is this, that he is collating this political struggle and the cultural struggle going simultaneously in 19th century Bengal at that time. So scholars are now, political scientists look to the 19th century much before, but I think cultural studies scholars, literary scholars are slowly coming to the 19th century. This is a slow change, a shift in their approach in research, but it's a welcome change. And I think in the days to come, young scholars will be working more on it. I know that there are scholars who are working on life writing of women writers and other poets from 19th century. So I think slowly this trend will change, and more of these writers will be translated, and the people will come to know more about them.
Wonderful. Well, our time is up, I'm afraid. We've had a late question in from Subhendra in the Q&A. I don't think we're going to have time, I'm afraid, Subhendra, to deal with your question. But can I thank Anindya on behalf of all our audience today for a wonderful presentation and a really generous question session as well. I'm fortunate that we're fortunate at BCLT to have you with us in your virtual residency for several more weeks. It strikes me that it's already a month into your residency, and time is flying very, very quickly. But we have a number of further engagements during your residency. As I mentioned, there will be, in about a month's time, late November, we're planning an event, a roundtable, which will focus on Bengali poetry once again. And in our research seminar series, can I flag up as well that we're going to, our next research seminar will feature Catherine Batchelor from University College London, and Catherine's going to be talking on the 24th of November, and she's going to you thematized Derrida today and autobiography, and Catherine is also going to be talking about Derrida, and she's going to be giving a new reading of Derrida's influential essay on qu'est-ce qu'une traduction relevante. So without more ado then, Anindya, thank you so much for your presentation today. It has been recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel shortly, and we look forward very much to the rest of your residency at BCLT as Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Fellow in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, for the platform today, and also for the anchoring and the question and answer session, and for everything. Thank you. And thank you everyone for all these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.